buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Yo más bien creo que debemos recibir a David Harvey con un fuerte y caluroso aplauso. Bueno, pues nos da mucho gusto, la verdad, estar acá en este espacio, en este maravilloso espacio de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, en el Foro José Ibañez, con David Harvey aquí. Welcome. Voy a permitirme leer y con los dos invitados que me acompañan. El recibimiento. El recibimiento. Con los dos invitados que me acompañan en esta tarde, en esta mesa, me voy a permitir leer unas breves palabras acerca del trabajo de David Harvey, que seguramente todos ustedes conocen y no haría falta ni siquiera mencionar una sola palabra, pero pues está aquí con nosotros en nuestra casa y nos da mucho gusto recibirlo. Es un honor para nosotros alojar esta presentación editorial dedicada a la historia del capital, The History of Capital, obra de uno de los pensadores más influyentes de las humanidades y las ciencias sociales, profesor David Harvey. David es actualmente un profesor distinguido en el Graduate Center de la City University of New York. ¿Está bien el sonido? En esta institución él ha consolidado una trayectoria intelectual de alcance global, formado en la Universidad de Cambridge, donde obtuvo su doctorado en geografía en 1962. Su carrera académica se ha desarrollado en algunas de las universidades más prestigiosas del mundo, incluyendo la University of Bristol, Johns Hopkins University y la Universidad de Oxford, donde ocupó la cátedra Hartford Mackinder de Geografía. Desde sus primeros trabajos, Harvey ha sido una figura central en la innovación crítica de la geografía y su articulación con la teoría social. Su obra se caracteriza por una profunda interlocución con el marxismo, así como por una constante preocupación por los procesos de urbanización, la justicia social, las dinámicas del capitalismo y sus expresiones espaciales. Entre sus contribuciones más influyentes destacan Explanation in Geography, editada en varias ocasiones en español, además, donde sentó las bases metodológicas fundamentales para la disciplina. Posteriormente, con Social Justice and the City, Harvey inaugura una línea de análisis que articula la crítica urbana con la teoría de la justicia, marcando un punto de inflexión en la geografía. Les decía de las aportaciones de David. Su obra, The Limits of Capital, Los Límites del Capital, también ha sido editado en español en varias ocasiones, y esta obra constituye una de las interpretaciones más rigurosas y sistemáticas del pensamiento de Marx en clave espacial, mientras que The Condition of Postmodernity ofrece un análisis decisivo sobre las transformaciones culturales y económicas del capital tardío. En el ámbito de la teoría urbana y la crítica del neoliberalismo, destacan títulos como Space of Hope, The New Imperialism, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Este último, por ejemplo, fue ampliamente difundido en el mundo hispanohablante y fue fundamental para comprender la reconfiguración global del capitalismo en las últimas décadas. Asimismo, obras como Space of Capital y París muestran la amplitud de su enfoque que combina historia, economía política y análisis cultural con una notable sensibilidad geográfica. La relevancia de su trabajo ha sido reconocida con múltiples distinciones internacionales. entre ellas la Patron Medal de la Royal Geographical Society y el Vautrin Lud Prize, considerado el equivalente al Nobel en el ámbito de la geografía. Asimismo, ha recibido numerosos doctorados honoris causa en universidades de Europa y de América Latina, lo que da cuenta de la recepción global de su pensamiento. Harvey ha abordado temas que hoy resultan cruciales, como la urbanización planetaria, las crisis del capitalismo, la acumulación por desposesión, los movimientos sociales y urbanos y el derecho a la ciudad. Su notable capacidad para articular teoría crítica con análisis empírico lo han consolidado como un referente indispensable, no solo para la geografía, sino también para la filosofía, la sociología, el urbanismo y en un sentido más amplio para el conjunto de las humanidades y las ciencias sociales. En este contexto, este libro que hoy nos presenta, The History of Capital, se inscribe como una obra que sintetiza y actualiza muchas de sus preocupaciones centrales, ofreciendo una narrativa accesible pero rigurosa sobre el funcionamiento histórico y contemporáneo del capital. Verdaderamente, presentar este libro en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras supone abrir un diálogo crítico sobre las condiciones actuales de nuestras sociedades, sobre las formas de desigualdad que nos atraviesan y sobre las posibilidades de imaginar alternativas. La obra, trayectoria y presencia intelectual del profesor Harvey, resulta indispensable para pensar nuestro presente. En esta mesa, además, nos acompañan, en esta sesión, nos acompaña Miguel Robles Durán. Miguel, bienvenido. Miguel es un urbanista con experiencia en el diseño y análisis de sistemas urbanos complejos y en la ecología política urbana. Es profesor de urbanismo en The New School, Parsons, New York, y cofundador de Cohabitation Strategies, una cooperativa sin ánimo de lucro reconocida a nivel mundial para el desarrollo socioespacial. También fue cofundador y codirector, junto con David Harvey, del Centro Nacional para el Derecho al Territorio en Ecuador. Investigador en el Center for Urban Research on Austerity en Reino Unido, su obra ha sido expuesta en numerosos espacios de todo el mundo, incluida la Bienal de Arquitectura de Venecia, la Bienal de Diseño de Estambul y en el MoMA de Nueva York. Julia Álvarez y Casa, la otra excelente y maravillosa compañía de esta mesa, es secretaria del Medio Ambiente de la Ciudad de México, especialista en Derecho por la UNAM, y durante su trayectoria se ha enfocado en los derechos humanos, con énfasis en los derechos humanos asociados a la economía, sociales, culturales y ambientales. Su trayectoria se ha caracterizado por una sólida articulación entre el activismo social, la gestión pública y el trabajo con organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Su labor se ha orientado principalmente a la promoción, protección y garantía de los derechos fundamentales, con especial énfasis en poblaciones en situación de vulnerabilidad. En este contexto, les quiero pedir un aplauso para toda la mesa. Y cederle la palabra a Miguel Robles Durán, quien nos va a hacer la participación, va a hacer el contexto de esta presentación. Después David nos hablará sobre su libro y en esta ocasión Julia Álvarez y Casa dará respuesta a la presentación de David Harvey. Adelante, por favor, Miguel.
Gracias. Muchísimas gracias por venir a todos. Es en verdad un privilegio para mí estar aquí. Nunca pensé haberme sentido, o sentirme como me siento ahorita. Y tiene muchas razones por las que siento esto. He estado en numerosas, pero no las puedo contar las veces que hemos estado juntos, David y yo, en un panel o en cosas así. Pero este tiene una connotación muy personal. Primeramente, David es mi mejor amigo. Lo conocí hace más de 20 años y y ha sido un compañero no nada más intelectual, pero realmente un compañero de vida. Mi vida fuera realmente terrible si no fuera por él. Y cuando me tocan hacer introducciones, generalmente hablo del marxismo, etcétera, etcétera, porque pues eso es lo que hacemos juntos, pero quiero tomarme la oportunidad de introducirlo realmente como la persona más excepcional que conozco. Y no porque es un gran intelectual, ¿no? Sino porque es una persona fantástica. Es una persona que verdaderamente es muy diferente a los otros intelectuales, las otras intelectuales que me ha tocado conocer a su lado. Y estamos hablando pues, de las personas intelectuales pues, que más resuenan en el mundo. Y hay una diferencia muy grande con mi amigo, que es que hay una autenticidad de quién es, a una manera de vivir o de entender al mundo como es y como actúa, y sin ninguna pretensión de elitismos o sin ninguna pretensión de que yo soy el intelectual más importante del mundo, porque pues, todos los que estamos aquí sabemos que algunos lo consideramos así, ¿no? Y eso es lo que yo creo que mucha gente no ve de él. O sea, todos leemos sus libros, ¿no? Todos a lo mejor vemos los YouTubes o lo que sea, ¿no? Que estamos en todo eso. Pero muy pocas veces tenemos la oportunidad de entender quién es esa persona, ¿no? Yo he tenido una fortuna tremenda de haberlo conocido y de haber pasado ya tantos años a su lado. No se imagina lo que he aprendido, ¿no? Bueno, sí se lo pueden imaginar, pero es más todo. Porque no nada más es la parte intelectual. O sea, he aprendido a ser más humano. ¿No? Y el tema es que cuando uno conoce a David se da cuenta de que es una persona como cualquiera de nosotros. Yo sé que no lo es, ¿no? Ahí voy para allá. En el sentido de que tiene las mismas inquietudes y las mismas preguntas que todos nosotros tenemos. O sea, siempre bromeo con él de que le van a preguntar, porque siempre pasa el caso, que, bueno, ¿qué debemos hacer, no? Como si él nos estuviera preguntando eso, ¿no? Que es también algo de todo el tiempo, ¿no? Está observando y viendo. Claro, no puedo negar que sí lo considero una de estas personas que les llaman, que vienen cada 100 años o más, porque su capacidad de absorción intelectual y de producción. O sea, yo apenas me la pasé 10 años terminando un libro y al final lo estoy terminando y ya terminó como 10, ¿no? O sea, así pasa. Lo mismo pasó con este último libro, la historia del capital, en el cual he estado involucrado en la creación totalmente de este libro. Y que vamos a comer, vamos a hacer lunch porque vivimos en la misma ciudad y viajamos a veces juntos, etcétera. Y me dice, oye, pero ¿qué piensas de esto? No, es que no sé si va a poner esto, pero en el momento que se pone a escribir, en el momento que se pone a hablar, ¿no? En YouTube o en una conferencia, el nivel de claridad que tiene es excepcional, ¿no? Entonces, me gustaría que también lo recibieran y me encantó la calurosa bienvenida como uno de nosotros, o sea, como una persona humana, porque lo es, y lo es increíblemente humano. Y les mencionaba que también era muy especial este momento porque yo soy mexicano. Yo nací en la Ciudad de México hace muchos años. Y me fui de México hace también muchísimos años. Estuve paseando por diferentes partes. Y el regresar a México desde hace 3 años, o hace más de 4 años, cuando empezamos a trabajar aquí en México con la organización que David y yo estábamos imaginando cuando éramos codirectores en este centro de Ecuador, en un centro de investigación que nos ha invitado el presidente Correa a dirigir, que era este sueño de generar una organización que logre apoyar a la proliferación de lo que nos decimos izquierda, ¿no? Que hay mucho debate en eso, pero sí desde un entendimiento anticapitalista, que eso es primordialmente a lo que nos dedicamos. Y cómo empujar a los gobiernos o a las organizaciones con las que hemos estado trabajando a pensar más radical, a atreverse, a tomar riesgo, entendiendo obviamente las limitantes que tienen los gobiernos para actuar en el mundo en el que estamos. Entonces, regresar aquí, no es la primera vez que estoy con David en la Ciudad de México. Y no en México, porque cuando platicamos más de este proyecto estábamos de vacaciones en Oaxaca. Y el estar aquí presentando su último libro, que considero yo es la síntesis de todo su trabajo. Pero lo que es magnífico de David es que muchos de ustedes que a lo mejor son geógrafos, etcétera, han leído otros pensadores. Digamos, voy a poner ejemplo a Henri Lefebvre, que es este filósofo francés muy famoso que hizo uno de sus libros, La producción del espacio, y muchos otros. Cuando tú lees la obra de Lefebvre, realmente tienes que tener como una especie de maestría en filosofía y tienes que entender la época, el contexto, etcétera, etcétera. Y entre más envejecía Lefebvre, más difícil era de entender realmente qué es lo que quería hacer. Y eso es exactamente lo opuesto con este libro. Este libro de David es verdaderamente el esfuerzo mayor de una persona que piensa que el lenguaje que ha prohibido que mucha gente entienda el pensamiento de Marx se vuelve un lenguaje completamente accesible. Con la total comodidad de que cuando David me dio la primera copia, cuando llegó allá, se lo di a mi hijo que tiene 18 años. Mi hijo lo está leyendo y está entendiendo todo. Entonces, esa capacidad de poder sintetizar, ¿no? Cuestiones que generalmente son complejas, cuando uno habla de Marx, bueno, ¿qué les puedo decir? O sea, todas las terminologías, etcétera, pero la capacidad de traer toda esta complejidad a un lenguaje que yo no lo diría accesible, pero un lenguaje común, ¿no? El cual se vuelve más complejo, yo creo, que lo que Marx mismo, o sea, escribe. Porque es limpio, no sé cómo decirlo, es algo muy excepcional en la manera en que se rige esto. Ahora, en este nuevo libro, también David habla de muchas cosas que sí en YouTube, sí a lo mejor en previos libros ha estado platicando, pero también a mí nunca me ha tocado leer a David ya un poco más atrevido, no hablando tanto de Marx, sino hablando de David Harvey. O sea, decir, yo soy, esto es lo que yo pienso, ¿no? Y una de las, por ejemplo, de las provocaciones, si han tenido la oportunidad de tener el libro, porque tengo entendido que se vendió rapidísimo y apenas están imprimiendo la segunda edición, porque no pensaban que se iba a vender tan rápido, es precisamente cuestionar a Marx, que no cualquiera puede hacer eso, ¿no? O sea, cualquiera, y le puedes hacer caso, porque mucha gente lo quisiera hacer, pero no le haces caso, ¿no? Y uno de los temas, por ejemplo, controversiales, es que empieza a ver a Marx como una persona que no entendió muy bien o que debió de haber expandido el concepto de clase. Y en este libro, David elabora muchísimo la idea de casta, ¿no? Como otra estructura de la cual no se ha hablado mucho. Y que muchas de las cosas que provienen o que tiene el capital también tienen que ver con estas relaciones. David también en este libro lo que hace es hablar de lo que, para mí lo que más me apasiona de sus cosas es el tema de la totalidad y que he tenido mucha oportunidad de trabajar a su lado con eso, incluyendo los diagramas que a veces pone, etc. El entendimiento del espacio como totalidad, pero no nada más como decir, analicen esto, esta es la totalidad del capital. Él ve a la totalidad y lo que ha diagramado como un mapa para que todos nosotros estemos entendiendo qué hacemos hoy día en nuestro trabajo en contra del capitalismo. Entonces, David nos da un mapa. Y estoy muy contento de estar pues, donde nací. Estoy muy contento de estar aquí al lado, de realmente de ver a mi amigo, pues yo creo que llegar a su magnum opus en el sentido que les platico, ¿no? No es el Límites del Capital, que si lo han leído es una cosa, es todo lo que llaman una obra, ¿no? Este libro es más que eso, ¿no? Sintetiza absolutamente todo lo que David ha pensado de su vida, sin haber hecho el Grundrisse, o sea, el companion o el compañero del Grundrisse, jamás pudiera haber hecho este libro, ¿no? Es como una secuencia. Ojalá lo puedan conseguir. Estamos conversando a ver quién va a ser la persona, bueno, la editorial que traduce a castellano y pronto lo van a tener, ¿no? Pero por lo pronto, pues aprovechen que está aquí. Y es muy emocionante realmente tenerlo en este contexto, en esta universidad que realmente significa tanto, ¿no? Gracias, amigo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ok, bueno, les dejo a David, ¿no? Con todo lo que es. Atrévanse a preguntarle al final sus cosas, ¿no? Y trátenlo como cualquiera de nosotros, en el sentido de que si le preguntan qué hacer, no sabe. Ok, gracias, David.
So I want to thank you all for coming, and also thank you for the invitation to come to a storied university with a big legacy of struggle. And I hope we will see as much future struggle as there has been past struggle. I'm also grateful to the table, and particularly to Miguel, who drew the diagrams for the story of capital, and also has been a constant companion, if you like, to some of the ideas which are coming out of that book. Why did I write this book? Well, I woke up the other day and I actually thought I'd written the wrong book. At first, it was very depressing. By the time I got up and had breakfast, however, I thought, oh, no, it's not, because I can write another book. Actually correcting all the things that are wrong with the existing book. The book is in a line that I've started to talk about as the Marx project. I didn't have this project and set it in motion and all of that. But just when I look back, I see I was in a project and I didn't even know it. And the project had a lot to do with trying to better understand what Marx was talking about, and to do it in a way that would have some faithfulness to Marx's own manner of proceeding, at the same time as it had the capacity to view Marx from the outside, to see what he was doing and perhaps understand a little bit why. I actually began doing that in the 1990s. The 1990s was interesting because in the first 5 years of the 1990s, no students would really take my classes. Marxism was dead. Communism was over. You're just a dinosaur. And you know, I have met academics who've taught the same book for 50 years, and I thought to myself, how lazy they are. And then I realized I've been teaching the same book for 50 years. But it's a testimony to the richness of the book, that actually every time I read it, I see something different. I understand something more relevant to what is going on in our world right now, even though it was a book written in the 1850s and 1860s. This situation that I found myself in was countered by the fact that in the 1990s, there was suddenly a lot of scandal going on in the international press. There seemed to be a new concern with fashion. And fashions started to become very significant in life. And fashions were changing. And therefore, there was a certain speed that needed to be there in the production and promotion of fashions. And so the Paris modeling game would go on a Tuesday night, On Wednesday morning, there would be cutouts of all of the things that were there on all of the production centres of clothing. 3 days later, it was in the shops. This was a different world. And this was moving very fast. And the exploitation of labour in that world was horrific. And certain scandals started to emerge. I could not get anybody to read Marx's Capital, but people would certainly read the account in the New York Times of the sweatshop conditions in Turkey or Bangladesh or Guatemala, and the zones in Mexico. And it suddenly seemed that what was so curious about this was here's this theory of capital, which was a beautiful explanation of what was happening in those sweatshops. But nobody would read it because nobody thought Marx was relevant anymore. So by the time I got to 1995, I thought to myself, that has to change. And we organized some things with students in which we put on a little play which was all about the passage of cloth from the textile industry to the workshops of Bangladesh. And it was a very, very, very telling situation. But here was the New York Times printing out for us exactly the same sorts of things you would read in Marx's chapter on the working day in Volume 1 of Capital. So out of an experiment one day, I thought I should set an exam. I hate exams. I do everything I can to avoid them. If I have to give a grade, I give everybody an A, and that's it. So I get quite a few students who come in just because they want A's, but okay. But what I said to the students was, why don't you write a letter home to your parents? This was the final essay they had to write. Write a letter home to your parents and saying, you're having an interesting time reading Capital. Because it is not, as you probably think, a defunct, old-fashioned, out-of-date way of thinking. It is, in fact, a perfect explanation of what is going on in the sweatshops of Turkey and Bangladesh. And if you want proof of it, here is an article from the New York Times that tells you that. So I said to them, well, I got some brilliant answers. So I then said to them, did you send the letter home? No. Why not? Well, if they know I'm reading Marx, I'll have a lot of trouble getting money for next semester. But this is a situation that seemed to demand rectification. So I started writing and, more importantly, studying very closely the texts of Marx. Now here I have to confess something, that people are quite rightly critical of my approach. Because from after 1995, I didn't read very much about what the Marxists said. There was so much there, it was all so different, it would take a lot of time to work it through and all the rest. So I decided, I'm sure it's great, I think it's nice, and please go away and read it. I'm not going to go and read it, I'm just going to read the text of Marx, and I'm going to ask the question, to what degree is the analysis that he's laying out there relevant to the situation today? And in what degree are things so changed from Marx's time that we need to actually supplement Marx's account by something different? So I began to think that way in around 1995, 1996. And I thought I should start to write things which were comprehensible Because as many people will remark, Marx's language is terribly difficult to read. Very hard. So I set about saying to myself, I'm going to try and write down what he's talking about in a way which is as simple as possible without being simplistic. That's a very difficult ledge you're on. You know, it's like this. You suddenly find you've written something and it's far too simplistic. Okay, go back and do it again. And then you realize it's simple. So you do these things but make sure that your audience can understand you. And in this I was very lucky, because I moved from my university in Baltimore to the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. And it so happened I moved there at the same time as quite a few students turned up who were radical in their thinking. And as a colleague of mine said, this group of students is not book-wise at all. They don't know the books. But politically, they're politically wise. It was a fantastic audience to work with. And after a bit, the leading one of their group said to me, we should put your classes on the web. I said, no, that's nonsense. My mentality with all of these things is about the year 1900. All those fads. But I got persuaded, and we put Volume 1 of Capital on the web. It was a fantastic success. I was astonished. So we said, well, we've got to do Volume 2, we've got to do Volume 2 and bits and 3, we've got to do other things, we've got to do the Grundrisse and all those kinds of things. But this was also, for me, a very good ground on which to explore what is simple and what is too simple and what's simplistic. It's very good. And the students, in effect, by coming back to me and saying we should have done it this way around, so the second year I did it and we put it on the web, it reads a bit differently from the first year. So this is the way the project evolved. And I started to say to myself, there are some concepts in Marx which I need to bear in mind. And now there are a lot of them, and I'm not going to give you the whole list because we'll be here till midnight. But Marx distinguishes between the concrete and the abstract. His first concept in Capital is the commodity. Okay, you've got a commodity, it's solid, you know what it is, you can talk about it. But then Marx says, but that commodity has two facets. It's a use value and it's an exchange value. What's more, those two functions are antagonistic. You can't use it if you've sold it. You can't sell it if you're using it. And then Marx says, this difference between its exchange value and its use value is really caught up with the idea of what is abstract and what is concrete. The concrete side of the commodity is the fact that people will pick it up, use it, eat it, do something. And that is very particular. Very particular. The exchange side is what it's worth in the market, and that's universal. So you have a theory which is both particular and universal at the same time. Bourgeois economics has a terrible time with this. Put that in front of a bourgeois, they don't know what to do. But Marx loves it and says, it's this contradiction between the use value and the exchange value which starts to put everything in motion. And when we ask the question, what is it that all these commodities have in common that allow them to be exchanged, Marx says, yes, there is something there, and we're going to call it value. And value we can think of as socially necessary, socially creative labor time. But then you say, oh, it's interesting. Labor. Well, the second passage in Marx's Capital is abstract labor and universal and particular value. So there's this thing about particularity and universality, abstract and concrete, starts to become a way of thinking about the world we're living in. So that we know that even though we're doing something which is very concrete, like eating a sandwich, by eating a sandwich we are connecting ourselves to the whole global economy. Now, I'm sure you don't want to have to think about that every time you eat a sandwich. But it is very significant. Because very shortly before that, in the 1990s, I also started to say to people, okay, next week when you come into class, I want you to tell me where your breakfast came from. And people would say, well, you know, I just went into the supermarket and I did this or I did that. And I said, well, no, where did it really come from? And after a while, I had them going back to the cane cutters in the Caribbean and things like that. And they got very tired. At one point, universally, they said, we did not have breakfast. But see the point. You are connected to the global economy, no matter whether you like it or not. Every time we do something. So what Marx does is to start to see this distinction between the universal and the concrete as something which is crucial. And I wanted to write a text about Marx in which I honored that distinction. In which I said, okay, here he is with this distinction about fixed capital, or here he is about labor capacity. But it has a fixed component which is universal and it's particular. And the particularity makes it easy for me to say to you, you are connected to the global economy through the sandwiches that you eat. And that contains within it a certain curiosity about where does the sugar come from? Where does the coffee come from? What are the conditions? What happens when suddenly you find you can't get your coffee anymore because there's a strike going on? What is the labor? Is it abstract labor or concrete labor? So in other words, working with Marx's categories is one of the most remarkable things you can do when reading Marx. Because you then find that all the categories relate to each other. They don't just, sugar doesn't live out there like that. It's related. And to me, I have to say, I'm very grateful to COVID. Because COVID put me in a situation where I couldn't go teach outside, couldn't do much. It was a pretty boring time, except I thought to myself, I needed a project. And the project was to write a companion to the Grundrisse. Now, of all of Marx's books, the Grundrisse is by far the most astonishing. I had read it several times, I had taught it several times. But when I came to write the companion, I found a completely different book. Because when I first read it, I was bowled over by some of these wonderful moments in the Grundrisse where Marx is clear as you could possibly want him to be. There are moments like that. And there were things I could take. He had statements like, oh, capital is all about the annihilation of space through time. I loved it, being a geographer. So I kind of said, go read Grundrisse, and I'd stick with that. But when I came to write the companion, it wasn't just simply, annihilation of space through time. There were all sorts of other things going on. Some astonishing things. In working on my urbanization, fixed capital formation and circulation was very important to me. So I took it all in from the Grundrisse and worked that through. And I suddenly realized there was a contradiction here. That labor was becoming more intensive, much more intensive. And it was largely because of the use of machinery, which is fixed capital, but also things that go with it, the factories and the roads and all that kind of thing. So there I was saying that the increasing productivity of labor has a lot to do with investment in fixed capital. And the more fixed capital gets in there, the more productive your labor, the richer society can become. So that was all in there. And then I get to a passage in the Grundrisse where he suddenly says, of course, in some situations, fixed capital can so improve the productivity of labor that actually capital can't absorb it. In other words, mass production, for example, means mass consumption. And if there's not enough mass consumerism out there, then you're in a real problem with the mass. So Grundrisse was very important on all of that, went through it all, but then said, but there's a complicated problem here, because fixed capital requires surplus capital from daily needs in order to get invested in it. But we've got this increasing productivity. Guy says, this can be actually contradictory. And then in an astonishing passage, he says, a lot of the time, fixed capital is just produced because nobody can think of anything better to do with capital. And I think, God, that sounds like 20th century urbanization. And suddenly I realized what Marx is proposing here is that urbanization is a dumping ground for surplus capital. And it is a dumping ground with horrendous consequences. For instance, in 1945, capital had just been through a huge crisis of the 1930s, followed by that of the Second World War. What was going to be the expansion that was going to absorb all that new productive capacity that had been built in World War II? What was going to happen to it? The answer was build suburbs. Suburbs are the most environmentally disastrous form of urbanization you can imagine. It has all kinds of social consequences. So here is Marx, actually in the Grundrisse, saying, and you can put it this way, and I'll be a bit dramatic about it. Capital survived after 1945 by dumping surplus capital into fixed capital formation and consumption fund formation. Fixed capital is that part of the fixed machinery which is used for production. The consumption fund is the similar stuff like housing and cars and so on. So that is where one of the big absorbers of surplus capital. That when capitalists didn't know what to do with it, they'd come up with projects. And of course, one of the projects, which I really like in this regard, is of course World Cup games. You build new stadiums, people come, spend a lot of money. It's a real boondoggle of capital. But the logic of it is it's a competition between nations. It's a class. It's what do I call it? Not the caste. The clan form. This is a clan form of social relation, which is being mobilized by the big developers and the big financiers and the big capitalists and all the rest of it, and turned into a class advantage. Even to the point where, of course, even the athletes start to get financed. So again, there's something concrete going on here, which is about the relationship between the class relation and the clan relation, which is very, very significant, and it's all over the place. So this is one of the arenas in which all of this surplus was utilized. The other arena is through military expenditures. After World War II, something emerged that President Eisenhower thought was very dangerous, and he gave in his farewell speech a great lecture on the dangers of the finance, the defense finance capital. And Marx had a very interesting thing in the Grundrisse. He said, of course, if you've got too much capital and you don't know what to do with it, you might just as well go to war, because then it's like dumping all surplus capital into the ocean. So how about thinking about the thesis that the capital survived after 1945 by massive investments in the built environment, in particular in the United States, the automobilization of everything worldwide, and the building of highways everywhere, the interstate highway system and all the rest of it. And it's so interesting. I go from one part of the world to another, and every damn city looks the same as every other damn city. They compete in how long your traffic jams can be. Mexico City is number one. So, you know, it's much more complicated than that. But as an idea, you suddenly think of it. Here's this little piece of language in Marx, which says how important fixed capital is in investment in machinery, and how important it is in roads and all that kind of thing. And it's all very positive. But he always will look for the negative. That is dialectics at work. Where's the negative side of it? And he gives you the negative side, and then you suddenly think, when I go back and I might write a critique of urbanization, well, Miguel's far more likely to do this than me, but when we do get into that, there's something in Marx about the particularity and the generality, universality. There's something about abstract and concrete. And we're following through something that's going on around us all of the time, and we ourselves are implicated within this whole process. And there is a way in which features within the process are being put together increasingly and at a faster speed. Now, the faster speed is interesting. You see, Marx argued, when he looked at the whole kind of theory of capital, he argued that actually speed up is actually something which is very valuable to the individual entrepreneur. If I can get my stuff to market faster than you, I defeat you in competition. Marx talks about the coercive laws of competition, in which we are all bound by abstractions rather than personal relations. I'm bound to people in the supermarket because of the abstraction, not because I have any personal relation with them. So personal relations start to disappear. And instead of that, we have the abstraction, which leads some people to ask a very interesting political question. How do you struggle against an abstraction? Think about it. It's quite interesting. But you have to start to think that way, because we are very much caught up in abstractions. And the abstraction that Marx talked about in the Grundrisse was, well, we've got to look at the turnover time of capital. That is, how fast does it go through being produced? How much time does it take to get to market? How much time does it take to get consumed? Put it all together and say, that's turnover time. The turnover time for a car is maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years, something like that. The turnover time for ice cream is 15 minutes. So you've got lots of different turnover times. And the turnover times are significant. Because Marx kind of says, the more capital runs out of things to do, and he talks about the production of an over-accumulation of capital, a plethora of capital, the more it runs out of things to do, what it does is it starts to find, some ways of moving faster. So he says, in a very competitive society, the optimal turnover time in consumption is 0. That is, you want to be able to make a product that takes 0 minutes to consume. Hard to imagine, but you could do it in 10 minutes, half an hour. You can do it watching a soccer game. See where I'm going? The kinds of things that have fast turnover times are no longer commodities. They're experiences. And the liberal period has been a period in which the neoliberalism has been about faster and faster turnover times. I mentioned the fashion industry earlier. It used to be it changed once a year, then it changed once to fashion. Now it's flash fashion, where you change every week. So you speed up. Turnover times go much faster. And interestingly, you're living in a world of faster and faster turnover times. Look at how fast the electronics industry has managed to penetrate as a form of consumption. How quickly do you get out of one model of the phone to another model of the phone? What's the turnover time of all that stuff? And of course, they're perpetually advertising, you know, you can get the new this and the new that and the new everything. And so actually, this turns on the whole idea of what the proletariat might be these days. In the old days, we used to think of a proletarian worker as somebody working in a car plant or a steel factory or down the mines or something of that kind. But now, they're less and less relevant as a form of consumerism. The monetization of experiences. Tourism is actually more important than manufacturing. And an interesting thing about tourism, it is, of course, about instantaneous consumption. But it needs a hell of a lot of fixed investment to take place. You need, my favorite example of this is cruise liners. I mean, if you'd showed me one of those things in 1980, I said, what the fuck is that? But they're all over the place right now. You can take a cruise liner anywhere, it seems. And it's beautiful because the consumption time is about 10 days or 7 days or whatever it is. But the amount of fixed capital that's involved in building those things, in doing that, and by the way, the employment is very high too. And actually, one of the problems which arises is how dependent even cities like New York are upon tourism. One of the things that Donald Trump delivered to us was an attack upon the Canadians who said they refused to come to New York anymore. New York has been having a hard time in the tourist trade because they're fed up with the United States doing the things that it's doing. But, you know, people in government are spending a lot of time these days trying to beautify their cities in such a way as to make them more... And now, of course, we have an anti-tourism movement. Places like Barcelona and everything else. Because tourism is very good at destroying the ecological base upon which it is predicated. So these things are going on, and they're going on in your lives. Marx is fully aware of those kinds of things because we still live in under the capitalist mode of production. And his analysis of the capitalist mode of production is absolutely phenomenal. So that you can learn a tremendous amount about it. Now, to say that is not to say he said everything that has to be said. Of course not. There are new things that are coming up, obviously. And there are many things in which Marx didn't really pay much attention to. When Marx was writing, the total global economy was, I don't know what it was, but it was less than $1 trillion a year. By the time you get to 1950, the total value of goods and services in the world is something like $9 trillion. So in 1950, you had to think about finding investment opportunities for $9 trillion. When we get to what is the situation now, you've got $100 trillion. You've got to start thinking about investment opportunities for $11 trillion. What the hell are you going to do with that? Why do we need all of that? And why is it that we can't actually put all that to hospitals and social services and all the rest of it? Because, you know, something is wrong and we have to correct it. And the only ideology that the neoliberals can think of is austerity, which makes things much worse. Because it's austerity for the mass of the population and socialism for the rich. Now, there's a lot of work to be done in all this. And what I tried to do in the book was give as simple an account as I could of the whole holistic ecosystem which capital has created and which is continuing to expand and continuing to expand at a proliferating rate. I mean, I remember vaguely welcoming, I've forgotten how many years ago now, the way in which you started to get a much more varied TV program. And, you know, there were channels that came up and you could watch old movies. It was quite pleasant. And then the platforms came along. And suddenly I want to get on and watch something, and I get a TV screen that's, you know, just packed with different things, all of which you have to pay $10 a month to utilize. I mean, this is crazy. This is crazy. Now, when we start to have a better understanding of the contradictions of this whole system, and at the center of the Grundrisse, there are two passages which in the companion to the Grundrisse, I highlighted. The first talks about the brilliance of the bourgeoisie in inventing new things, in freeing us from religious sentiments and nature worship and allowing us a deep understanding of how the world really worked in through creative science. And here you read this passage and it's about 2 pages and you're saying, this is Marx writing this? It's a fantastic positive account of what the bourgeoisie has done. A few pages later, he talks about the toxicity of the market and of capital, and that how the toxic relations predominate. It's all about creative destruction. It's all about violent reconfigurations. So you have these 2 images of what capital is about. And you can't say that somehow or other, oh, it's not about both of those things, it's about one or other of them. Go look at the situation with artificial intelligence. There are clearly brilliant things that could be done with artificial intelligence. I even used it to give me a definition of totality. It was a very good definition. I liked it a lot. Thank you. So it's possible to imagine that being used in a creative way for human betterment. But in exactly the same way that the internet, which initiated up the idea of a completely different set of social relations in which we would be all communicating happily with each other. It was a kind of immense utopianism that came in 1992 or 3. Communism is dead, the internet's arrived, everything is going to be okay. Fukuyama says the end of history is here. We all just settle down and enjoy our Netflix. So this is it. But what we need to do is to understand where all of this is coming from. Because the great thing about thinking about totality is you can have a problem at place X, and you start to really hammer on place X, and what you find is that nothing happens at all, because really what was happening in point X is actually a product of what is going on at point Y. Once you understand these connections, you can start to work with them. And if we collectively start to think about what are the primary contradictions of this system, in what ways can we take the creativity of the bourgeoisie and all of its brilliance and culture and all the rest of it in the way that Marx talked about it? You know, if we say, yes, 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 we can move towards that, but we have to deal with this toxicity. And the problem, of course, with almost every new technology that comes into being is it has this double side. You can't escape. It's not as if you can abolish it by fiat. You can't. I would like to abolish by fiat half the people doing this artificial intelligence, but, you know, that's not going to happen. So this is what the book is aiming at. I don't make much of any exact recommendations. But for another very simple reason, and I'll just push this one here, the final thought. One of the chapters I have in the book, is one of my favorite, is Marx in Manchester. Marx lived in England in the mid-19th century. This was a time when industrial capitalism was taking off in the factory system. Marx was very aware of this because Engels' family ran a factory in Manchester. Marx says, look, I use the Manchester case because that is an image of our own future. The whole world will soon look like Manchester. He was wrong, in part because even when Marx was writing, there were areas of England where there was a completely different kind of capitalist economy. Where was the steam engine invented? Who made the steam engines? They weren't really set up in Manchester. They were set up in Birmingham. Birmingham produced guns, produced jewellery. It had small artisan labourers. They were not the cotton employees. So this was the situation. Marx needed to recognise that there was another kind of capital around. And so one of the questions which we might pose to ourselves is, what kind of society would we want for our future? What kind of productive apparatus would we want? How would we get it? And I think that this is one of those moments, historically, when we have all kinds of opportunities, but we have all kinds of social reasons which are not being looked into. And of course, urbanization is still a dumping ground. War? Oh no. The military-industrial complex is having a great time at the moment. They announced that government has given $8 billion to Ukraine. In fact, it's given $8 billion to the US manufacturers of the rather useless rockets it's got compared to the very cheap drones. So these are some of the things which come out of the book and are there for critique. And I try to do it in a way that's understandable. I probably failed in some instances. I'm sure there are accounts out there which are much better than mine on many aspects, and I think you should go and read them. But I think you should read my book and then see what you think. Thank you.
Gracias, David. Le voy a pedir ahora que tome la palabra para comentarnos sobre esta exposición.
Sí.
Muchas gracias, Francis. Gracias a todas y a todos, y principalmente muchas gracias, David, por estar aquí. Bueno, les quiero contar que hace unos días definitivamente hice algo extremadamente bien para estar aquí el día de hoy. Creo que ni en mis más remotos sueños imaginé nunca estar en este espacio, con este foro, al lado de uno de esos hombres que nacen cada 100 años, como David Harvey, compartiendo un pequeño espacio muy humildemente de unas palabras que quizá puedo compartir. Miguel me dijo hace unos días, como si fuéramos a tomar un café, porque así lo hacemos, confabulamos a favor de la ciudad, y me dijo, ay, por cierto, el martes te quiero invitar a comentar algo del libro de David Harvey, y me lo soltó así como de, vamos a vernos para hablar sobre los ríos de la ciudad. Y no creo que los cafés no sean importantes, ni hablar de los ríos de la ciudad, pero definitivamente esta trama de la historia es muy especial. Así que bueno, además de por supuesto ser un privilegio de estar aquí, es mucha responsabilidad intentar hacer un comentario después de escuchar a David Harvey. Así que con toda humildad y por culpa de Miguel, intentaré aterrizar algo, mínimamente algo de los preceptos que plantea David ahora y que plantea en su libro y en su pensamiento respecto a lo que estamos haciendo en la ciudad. Me parece que lo primero que tengo que decir es que es un libro consecuente con las premisas del propio libro. Pues tal cual como se establece en el escrito, y parte de la premisa de que, y creo que este libro es en sí mismo la consecuencia del movimiento del mismo capital. El capital, tal como lo dice David Harvey, no solo es dinero o empresas, es un proceso en movimiento que se transforma continuamente en la sociedad, en las ciudades y en la vida cotidiana. Entonces creo que este libro es justamente el producto de eso, de una nueva interpretación con los mismos o con preceptos para entender el capital en el día de hoy. Y de ahí quiero volver a agradecer y decir gracias por escribir este libro, David, porque hace muy poco tiempo yo estaba ahí sentada en alguna de estas butacas en este auditorio y poco a poco le fui robando en la biblioteca de mis abuelos el volumen 1, 2 y 3 del Capital y los leía en la biblioteca central que está aquí a un lado, y justamente me sentí como uno de tus alumnos que intentaba entender cómo el Capital de Marx se podría aterrizar a lo que estaba pasando hoy en el mundo. Así que gracias, porque mi Julia estudiante y seguramente muchos estudiantes que están acá, agradecemos profundamente este esfuerzo que haces por hacer accesible y que podamos seguir hablando de estos temas que, como bien lo has dicho, son más que actuales. Y bueno, me sobra decir que gracias, Francis, por permitirme abrir las puertas de este espacio. Yo estudié Derecho en la Facultad de Derecho de la UNAM, sin embargo, todos los semestres me daban la bienvenida como oyente de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras. Así que seguro por mi aspecto no entraba mucho en el estereotipo de abogada, así que una parte de mí se siente que todos los semestres estudió en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras. Bueno, regresando a la ciudad y retomando las ideas de David como las ciudades en donde el capital se materializa en vivienda, transporte, espacio público, y haciendo un esfuerzo realmente extraordinario por aterrizar alguna de las ideas aquí planteadas en lo inmediato, en la Ciudad de México, y no solo en la Ciudad de México, sino una ciudad que está viviendo un proceso de transformación profunda, que formamos parte de un movimiento que le llamamos la Cuarta Transformación de la Vida Pública, que inició el presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador y que hoy está continuando en la ciudad Clara Brugada y en el país Claudia Sheinbaum, y creo que desde ahí intentaré ligar simplemente 3 ideas. Primero, decir que efectivamente nosotros nos estamos cuestionando de dónde viene el sándwich y de dónde viene el café que consumimos todos los días. Tal vez acá lo más común es preguntarnos de dónde vienen las quesadillas que consumimos, de dónde vienen los tlacoyos, los sopes, de dónde vienen los ingredientes que forman parte de nuestro consumo diario. Y desde ahí quiero decir, y tal vez hago un guiño a la parte más ambiental de todo este cuestionamiento, que además David lo mencionó en 3 ocasiones, y bueno, porque tengo un sesgo, porque es el encargo que me dio la jefa de gobierno Clara Brugada para encabezar en su gobierno. Entonces, uno de los principales cuestionamientos justamente tiene que ver con cómo vinculamos a la ciudad urbana, al suelo urbano de la Ciudad de México, con el suelo rural de la Ciudad de México. Pocos de ustedes saben, pero el 60% del territorio de la Ciudad de México en esta jungla de concreto es suelo de conservación. Y entre otros, en ese suelo de conservación se producen alimentos. 20,000 hectáreas tenemos todavía agrícolas en la Ciudad de México, y algo que nos hemos cuestionado profundamente es cómo regresar a consumir, por ejemplo, lo que se produce aquí. Después, nada más como quisiera poner una idea central para la discusión, es que efectivamente lo que David ha llamado tiempo de rotación, en el tiempo del capital es todo rápido, y la visión ambiental que nosotros impulsamos desde la Ciudad de México y en general predomina en el mundo ambiental, siempre está asociado a la sostenibilidad. La sostenibilidad es absolutamente todo lo contrario al tiempo de rotación veloz, a la velocidad que demanda el mundo del capital, porque pensar en medio ambiente es pensar en presente y en futuro también. y generalmente la idea del capital asocia a lo inmediato sin pensar en que eso puede tener una consecuencia a futuro. Es individualista porque solamente pensamos en nuestro bienestar inmediato, la felicidad efímera, rápida, y no pensamos en las consecuencias de la felicidad de más largo plazo. El capital acelera todo, la producción, el consumo, y desde ahí quisiera también plantear una idea que uno de los principales retos desde el medio ambiente y desde el medio ambiente pensado desde la ciudad es, por ejemplo, ¿qué hacer con nuestros residuos? La Ciudad de México genera casi 14,000 toneladas diarias de residuos sólidos urbanos y esos residuos están pensados justamente en desechar permanentemente. Entonces, la economía circular que propone primero reducir, luego reutilizar y luego reciclar, cuestiona y pone en el centro esta idea de rotación y de velocidad que es intrínsecamente ligado al capital. En segundo lugar, el capital nos quiere como consumidores, como decía David. Para el capital no somos ciudadanos y ciudadanas, somos consumidores. Los gobiernos progresistas lo que intentamos construir es todo lo contrario solo a consumidores, sino intentamos construir ciudadanas y ciudadanos para garantizar el derecho a la ciudad, para garantizar el pleno ejercicio de nuestros derechos y salirnos de la idea de que somos simples personas que producen, consumen y desechan, producen, consumen y desechan. En ese sentido, hay una de las políticas centrales de este gobierno son las utopías, que también David habló de las utopías. Y acá la jefa de gobierno, Clara Brugada, está haciendo realidad las utopías. Y las utopías no son otra cosa que un modelo de urbanismo social que repiensa a las sociedades y pone en el centro el debate del cuidado. Que el cuidado también es un debate sobre el tiempo y que que problematiza sobre todo el rol de las mujeres en el cuidado. Entonces, tenemos ahora, y con esto cierro, tenemos un gobierno que se identifica como un gobierno progresista, como un gobierno que pertenece a la cuarta transformación, que ha puesto en el centro del debate el neoliberalismo y muchos preceptos que David plantea del capitalismo, incluso navegando en las propias contradicciones. Entonces, yo algo que quisiera plantear, tal vez como una pregunta, no voy a hacer la pregunta de qué hacemos, porque ya estamos amenazados de que no podemos hacer esa pregunta, pero creo que quisiera dejar sobre la mesa cómo navegar con las contradicciones del sistema y cómo hacerle para salir avante entre ellas y poder seguir siendo una opción realista, viable para las ciudades, como los primeros lugares de transformación para los países, incluso en un mundo lleno de contradicciones. Y para botón de muestra, un ejemplo, mañana saben todos que va a venir el Mundial, llega en unos días a la Ciudad de México, ya casi un mes y piquito, y uno de los temas centrales, por ejemplo, es cómo navegar con esas contradicciones, ¿no? Entonces, yo querría cerrar diciendo...
Agua para los pueblos, no para las empresas.
Yo...
Para los mexicanos, no para los extranjeros.
Exactamente. Arriba la Huasteca.
Vuelta a la cuarta transformación y viva la autogestión de los pueblos.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Gracias, David.
Una excelente, me parece, intervención de Julia Álvarez y Casa, que pues da respuesta, enlaza la realidad que vivimos en Ciudad de México con la temática de David Harvey. Y pues yo les quiero pedir nuevamente un aplauso para David e invitarlos a que como se había prometido, a que trajeran acá usamos mucho las fotocopias, a que trajeran sus libros, sus fotocopias, para que David nos hiciera el favor de autografiarlas. ¿Y qué les parece si despedimos a David con una Goya universitaria?
Pumas, universidad.
Goya, Goya, cachún, cachún, ra, ra, cachún, cachún, ra, ra. Goya, universidad.